Picking up where I left off. It's round 2 with the Earthborn dire troll that I got out of my Privateer Press mystery box. If you missed the first video, you can find a link to it here where I painted the skin and opened the box up. In this video, I'm just going to be finishing the rest of him. The stones around his whole body, his little bit of clothes, and his very animated face. Starting with the stones. I could easily paint these just as uniform rocks, but I want some variation. So while most will be a reddish gray, I want to disperse gems and obsidian parts throughout. So I'm just going around marking which of those I want to be what, so I'm not painting the same stones a couple of times over needlessly. For my first layer, I don't want just a pure gray. I think since so far this guy's pretty colorful, I want to keep some of that color. So using a primer gray, I'm mixing in some red oxide and some phthalo green. The green is just going to move the red away from being pink when lightened up by the gray, but I still want it to be towards the red shade of things. With this, I'm just going to base coat all the stones I didn't mark. At first, things were alright with a large flat brush, but as I started getting towards the smaller stones, I decided it would be better just to take out a normal large brush, since it would allow me to pick out both large and small stones. After the first layer dried, it wasn't all that even, so like most base coats, I went around once more just to make it a more flat, opaque layer. But since there's going to be a lot of processing going on over top of this, I'm not too worried that it's not perfectly even either. Time to fill in all those marked portions now. I'm doing a base coat of dark blue, as these will be blue gemstones. And for the black parts, I'm using black, but with a bit of white mixed in, so it's not just a pure black, as I'm going to want the wash layer after this to show up a little bit at least. And over a pure black, I don't think it would show up that much. Eventually I'm going to have to treat each of these stones as separate parts, but for now I've got to darken them up, which means it's wash time. But washes can still be a time to get creative with color, so I've got a few open here. Nuln Oil, Argrax, but also a green and flesh shade, as well as a purple tone from the Armory Painter line. Basically, this is going on like any other wash, but every time I go to dip my brush, I change the color and let them mix over the surface of the stones. So instead of it becoming all one even color, some of the gray stone will be green and some more red. Anything that looks a little too extreme, that's what the Nuln Oil is for, using the black pigment to desaturate the colors a bit. Once that dried, I set up my palette for some layering. Since I now have different color stones, I want to keep them that way, so make 3 separate grays with tints. One with a red tint, one with a green tint, and one with a purple tint made by mixing some blue into the red. I was supposed to add some medium to each of the mixes but forgot here, so ended up doing that after the first few stones. The idea here was to outline all the edges of the rocks, but also blend them a bit into the flat areas that were higher towards the light. The reason for the 3 colors is that any time a stone looked more red because it was covered with Argrax, I'd use the red tint, green for where I turned the stones green, and purple for where I used the purple wash. But I had too much blue in it at first, so added some more of the red to get it back towards a more neutral cool stone color, but not too much like I'm going to have in the gems. Time for one last layer. No mixes needed this time, just taking the neutral gray and mixing in lots of medium. With this mixture, I once again use a fine brush to outline the edges of the stones, keeping the lines pretty thin to start with, getting the basic shape of the rocks, then using the diluted pigment suspended in that medium, I start to feather in towards those edges. This way, I still have my solid outline, but it's not as stark a contrast as it would be with just the outline. Always pulling the paint towards the edges before I lift my brush, so that any pooling happens where there is already a solid line. I want to show something pretty cool you can do with these flathead brushes since I got a new one. I'm using a palette paper that doesn't bead the paint like I usually prefer, and I'm only using a phthalo blue and white. By dipping each side of the flathead brush into the different colors and drawing it in a line along the palette, I create a gradient with the bristles of the brush itself, so that when I draw the brush along a flat area like the large gemstones here, it creates that gradient with just a quick stroke. This way I can get a really light transition to a dark one on these gems. Though like base coats, this actually works best if you do it a couple of times in the same spot in the exact same way. Now that I've got a fast gradient on the gems, I'm just going to mix a solid light blue with the blue and white, and use this to create outlines around each of the gems, finding those edges and giving them a sharp light, but also wetting my brush and wiping some out on a paper towel to create a quick glaze, which I feather towards those edges a bit again as well, adding highlight reflections with the sharp tip of my brush. Using some thinned, pure white now, I really want to make these gems sparkle, so I find the point I want to highlight and edge highlight outwards from them a bit. And then once I've got that traced in, I start to add reflection lines, just thinly, parallel to each other on the flat surfaces, but also add a little ping star to those extreme points, making sure there are more solid opacity than the lines I drew away from them. One more time I want to do that trick with the flat brush, but if I replace the white with a medium instead, what I get is an opacity gradient instead of a color one. I want to make sure these gems are really contrasted and want to give those lower halves more shadow. By using this feathered gradient, I can have heavy shadows towards the base of the gem while it tapers off towards my highlights. The black obsidian stones were the exact same process, though instead of using blue and white, I used a black and white. Starting with a gradient, adding outlines, highlighting those outlines, then shading back down. To get started on the loincloth, which I can only imagine to be some kind of leather, I'm going to go towards a reddish brown, mixing orange and red oxide into a black for a simple base coat. These colors are all quite opaque, so it actually goes on pretty nicely in a single layer. To start layering, I begin with the red and orange mix, but only a touch of black this time, using my standard brush to stipple a texture onto the ridges and folds of the leather, avoiding the band holding it all up for now. I just thought I'd save some time and get the base coat at the same time. I stipple here because I want the texture, but also because it's not a standard cloth fold. The angles are kind of weird, being that it's behind him and fluttered up, so stippling just allows me to gradually figure out where these highlights should go. Once that's down, to bring the base and the stippling together a bit more, I water down some of the stippling color and use it to glaze, pulling the paint in towards the heavily stippled areas, but letting it extend past the area as well. This should give it a much more uniform look, while keeping some of that texturing. With some of the pure orange and red, I finish with some highlight stippling, just a little bit along the edges and the high folds of the leather. I want to keep this mostly dark and pretty saturated, so I won't be using any white this time to take it any further. I knew I was going to do a wash, but at first it was only going to be a brown wash. But now that I've seen this color against the backdrop of the skin a bit more, it seems to be too orangish for me. So to try and bring it back into harmony a bit, I actually add some magenta into the brown for a wash. And like the one I did on the skin, control it by keeping my brush moist with clear water and only dipping the tip into the wash so it can feather out from the deep folds to the lower ones. After that first wash dried, I was happy with the color shift, but not the darkness, so added a bit more black and re-washed it the same way. The two pooled layers should give me a much darker contrast between the light orange and the dark magenta shades. For the bandages, I could have painted them leather as well, as the box art had just made it all the same, but I'm gonna instead go for something a bit more light. Though I went kinda crazy on the mixing, adding magenta, orange, warm yellow, black, and finally some white to see what color I ended up with, then just kept mixing until I was happy. Basically, I'll never get this mix again. But when it comes to painting it, I'm just doing a pretty opaque layering over the bandages, painting lines parallel with the edges to pick out subtle curves on the inside of it. For the next layer, I add more yellow and more white. I figured it was a little too orange, so by adding more of the yellow, as I add more and more white while I highlight, it will push it more towards a khaki than a brown. This one's also getting a pretty solid opaque layering with a standard size brush, leaving those darkest recesses with the base brown that I used on all the leather. Mixing in more of that white into the base, I just take another step up towards that khaki color, this one acting as the highlight before the textured highlight that comes directly after it. The last bit of white, almost a pure white, but still with a tiny bit of the last mixture in it. With this one, I add some additional texture by stippling the upper edges along most of the sharpest ridges, this time going the opposite direction of the highlight edge, so that it would give it a cloth texture, as I'm kind of pretending these are more woven than leather grips would be. Lastly, I want to darken them up a bit. They're far too bright compared to the rest of the miniature at the moment. So to start, I just mix some black into the yellow base I used and add some medium as well, using that mixture to wash in the crevices of these wraps, leaving the edges for now. Then with a mix of just orange and black to make a neutral brown and a lot more medium by ratio than it, use that to create splotches of glazing randomly around them, trying to be as ununiform as possible. The last big ticket item I want to get done for this guy is his face. He's got that wide open jaw with a look inside at all his teeth, so I want to get the teeth right. So I'm going to start with a mix of red oxide and magenta mixed with black, just doing an overall base coat, making sure to get between the teeth and base coating the big fangs too. I want to make his upper palate stick out a bit, so I want to give it a bit of texture. Using a mixture of just the red oxide and magenta, I draw lines along the upper part of his mouth to get those ridges that we all have on the roofs of our mouths. Since I'm not really sure what an earthy tongue would look like, I think I'm just going to stick with red, but mix in a bit of phthalo green to darken it and brown it out some. Then do a bit of loaded brush with pure red towards the tip of the tongue with the dark mix at the back. Should just be a quick affair, so I do it twice just to make sure it comes out smooth. Now I can start to darken towards the back of his mouth, using the base color and a bit more black and magenta to wash it, leaving most of the pooling in the center of his mouth. Once it dries, a bit more black and another accurate wash again just at the back of his mouth. Getting a bit on the tongue too, as I'm trying to make it look like the light's disappearing the further back we look into his gullet. One last wash of a pure black gives me the terminus of where we should visually see. For the teeth, I do want to try and blend them a bit before making them bone, so do a layer of my bone color mixed with the magenta and red oxide. For this, I just do normal full layers over the teeth, leaving only the gaps between them. For the big fangs, I do a full base coat with that mix first, getting close to the gums but not too close. Because once that dries, in order to blend out that gum to tooth transition, I add some of the base mix without the bone in it to the tip of the brush and loaded brush blend it into those gums, so they transition out from them. Then with the bone color and a bit of yellow, I mix up to do a stain layer for the teeth, giving them all a quick dot with this, mostly on just the front side though. For the fangs, I twist my brush on the palette into a really nice point so that I can draw lines along the fangs to get that striated look you see on horns often. The last highlight will be the pure bone. For the small teeth, this just gets dotted on the teeth that are closest to the front of the mouth, creating a bit of a difference towards the teeth at the back of the mouth. While the fangs get retraced over the previous highlights, matching them, but just a little bit further up the tooth. And finally, one more loaded brush, just to blend out the patterns I just painted onto the fangs. This time, diluting out the bone quite a bit, then dipping the tip of the brush into the base color used for the mouth overall. Starting at the gums again, I blend it out towards the tip. This should give the bottom of the star pattern a bit of a tint to the base color, while thinning out before I get to the bone tooth tip. To finish him up, I got the eyes with a few dots of black, white, and green, while the toe and fingernails were done with layers of brown washed with a bit of green. This guy ended up feeling like a lot more work than anticipated, but when it comes to these kind of things, the more work you put in, the better it turns out, and I'm quite proud of this one. The colors all fit the theme of the model to me, and even though I added lots of personal flourishes, it still works to make a harmonious whole. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.